I am so glad to see you, and I'm glad to be here. Last week, I felt like if I died, I'd been better off, but we made it anyway. So the crud got me, and I want to thank Tom for taking Wednesday night class for me. It is good to be live and almost well. So we're continuing our study through the book of 1 Peter. We're going to talk about what it means to live a holy life in an unholy world. That's what Peter is having to address to those Christians who have been scattered because of their faith in Christ. They were deemed the enemy of the state, if you will, because of their beliefs. And I want to begin with an illustration, because Peter is going to talk to us today about respect and submission. The captain of a ship, in looking into the dark, saw a faint light in the distance, and he immediately told his signalman to send the message, alter your course 10 degrees south, because he knew there was going to be a collision if one of them didn't alter their course. The message was received, and the message returned was, you alter your course 10 degrees north. The captain was very angered about that, and he was angered that his command was ignored, so he sent a second message, you alter your course 10 degrees south, I am the captain. There was another signal sent back and said, alter your course 10 degrees north, I am Seaman Third Class Jones. Now this really angered this captain of the ship. He said, alter your course 10 degrees south, I am a battleship. Now he said, boy, that'll show him. The response came, you alter your course 10 degrees north, I am a lighthouse. As sojourners, we live in the midst of the dark and foggy cultural times. There's all sorts of voices out there shouting to us to alter our course, asking us to adjust our lives according to their standards and their culture and their beliefs and their understandings. And they're telling us that what we have accepted as right and wrong must be rejected. And what happens is some Christians began to become confused. The Word of God calls us to do something quite opposite of what culture constantly demands of us. And some of the things culture asks us to alter and change sometimes even goes to the absurd. But if we follow the voices of culture and not the voice of God, we're going to end up on the rocks. We're going to crash. We will lose our lives and eventually our souls if we follow culture. And it was no different in the times Peter is writing to these Christians. They're scattered because they refused to alter their course and they were run out of their own home country. But even so, even though culture was demanding you alter your course to fit what we like, Peter is reminding those Christians, I know you want to get along with people in your culture, but you don't change what God says. And you don't change what God calls holy living. So culture will be satisfied with you. And so Peter gives them several principles of how we are to live in a pagan world. And brethren, we live in a pagan world. He begins by telling them every believer is to be an advertisement for Christianity. He said, living as aliens in this world, we are tempted to do one of two things. One of the things we sometimes are tempted to do is confinement. That means we are tempted to get alone by ourselves and avoid the world completely. And if the world is making fun of you, as they were in the early church, one of the strong motivations is to get away from that. And just get away from the world, stay quiet, stay away, be isolated, and avoid the world entirely. The other temptation is conformity. That means let's just try to fit in and live our lives in such a way that nobody will pick on us. We will just alter our course in any direction necessary to keep the world off our back. Now, this may keep the world from picking on you, but this will never bring anyone to Christ or show the world what Christ looks like. Peter is going to tell us that we cannot find or follow Jesus by following either one of those options. We do not confuse conformity, or we do not choose conformity, because there is a spiritual war going on out there, and it's a world of sinful desires that not only is being listened to by the world, but even in our own lives there are desires that are sinful that we ourselves have to wrestle with. But Peter is saying, in spite of that, we are to live as strangers and aliens in this world, which means we cannot be like everyone else. But at the same time, Peter is recognizing and telling us that we must be aliens and strangers. He said that in verse 12. And one of the great temptations among Christians is to form Christian ghettos. Now, what that means is we just gather together in our own little group and stay together, and we're the only people we ever have contact with. So we pull out of the world to be alone with ourselves. But Peter says in verse 11, as aliens and strangers in the world. He says in verse 12, among the pagans. We're not to build walls to separate ourselves from the world. We're not to build those walls so they can't notice our lifestyles. We are not to separate ourselves from the world because we are to be walking advertisements for Christianity, and in particular for Christ. Where? Among the pagans, Peter is telling us. Brethren, we have been called. We have been called for something. To be walking advertisements for Christ in this world. But we have not been called to be part of the world, but nor disengaged from the world. We are not called to be like the world while we are in the world. The incarnation of Jesus is a divine act of God's intrusion into a broken and evil world. And Jesus was not disengaged, but engaged with the world. How? Through ministry, through teaching, through living, through showing this fallen world how to live under the authority of God. I hope you caught that. We have been called to live as aliens and strangers to this world, as advertisements for Christ, to show this world how to live under the authority of God. He has not called us to be part of the world. He has called us to be in the world for the purpose of changing this world, which means we are countercultural to our culture to change our culture. And we do it for the same reasons Jesus did it. Which brings us to the second thing Peter tells us. He tells us that as aliens and strangers in this world, our walk carries more weight than talk. When it comes to living our lives before the pagans in this world, we have got to remember this principle. This does not mean that we are never to teach or preach the truth of Christ. What this means is that before we tell the truth, we must first be living it. If we're not living it, we have no message. Strangers are always closely watching the citizens, are closely watched by the citizens of the land. Let me give an example. Have you ever lived in the neighborhood where strangers moved in? And what do we do as neighbors who have been there for a while? We watch them. They're strangers. They're aliens to our neighborhood. And we watch them. And if they're different, what's it the human nature to do? To judge them. And Peter is telling us that we are going to be closely watched by this world. And by the way, as Christians, when they watch us, they're not going to give us any slack. They're not going to give us any slack. Now, they may not agree with what we believe or how we live, but people of this world will always recognize one thing: basic goodness. So Peter says in verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. What Peter is saying, let your walk silence their talk. And this is a summary of what Paul said in Romans chapter 12. You overcome evil with good. Now, where did even Paul get an idea like that? Well, Jesus himself said it in Matthew 5:16, where he said, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. What message is my life and good deeds saying about the gospel that I say I believe and I want to share with others? What does my life say about that? You see, my life and your life are walking advertisements for God, and the world's watching. This leads us to the third principle about how to live the life of Christ in this pagan world. And Peter says, we must live the submissive walk. What do most people do when they're harassed or persecuted? What's the temptation there? I have heard even Christians say this: I don't get mad, I get even. Reminds me the story of a young lady who was working at an airline ticket desk, and while she was working there, a man in line was at the counter, and he was arguing with her. He was belittling her. He was cursing at the young woman, and she was trying her best to prepare his airline ticket. He was in a hurry. He was very, very rude to her, and yet through the whole thing, she was very polite. She was very calm. She was very nice. And finally, when she got the ticket ready, she handed it to him, and he stomped off and called her stupid. The next man in line that witnessed the whole thing was a preacher. And he was really impressed by the way that she conducted herself, considering how she'd been treated. And he told her, he asked her, he said, how can you do that? He said, I was really impressed with how nice you treated that man who was so mean to you and called you such ugly things. How were you able to do that in such a sweet way after all that verbal abuse? And she smiled and said, well, it was easy. That man is going to New York. I just sent his bags to Mexico City. Would you not agree that that's the basic reaction of people in the world? I don't get mad, I get even. Do you remember Jesus in the garden? They came to arrest him. What's the first thing Peter did? He pulled out his sword and he declared, you don't pick on us without a fight. And Jesus healed that man's ear that he'd struck. Peter was operating the way this world operates. And Jesus said, you don't operate like that in this world, not under the authority of God. The Bible is not unaware of people, especially God's people, who are going to be picked on and victimized in this world. The Bible's not unaware that that happens and is going to happen, will continue to happen. The Bible even gives us examples of people that were not treated fairly because of following God. A few are Job. One is Joseph. Another is David. These people lived lives to glorify God, and yet they suffered because life is just sometimes not fair. The Bible does not pretend that life will be fair if you do good. The Bible doesn't preach that or teach it. The Bible is very honest. It's very honest with this fact that if you live a very good, a very clean, and godly life, life will still not necessarily be fair. And Peter comes along and says, but you have a weapon. You have a weapon when that happens. And you can use that weapon against your enemy. And that weapon is mightier than the sword. And do you know what that weapon is? Submissive walk. You walk submissively. It may not be the weapon many would choose. It would not be the weapon that most would want. But let me tell you, it is the weapon that works. Notice verse 13 of our text. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority. In verse 18 he said, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also those who are harsh. Later in chapter 3, verse 1, Peter is going to say, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands. The way that we live as strangers in this alien and hostile world is that we walk the submissive walk. This is how we let our lights shine and silence our critics. Now, how popular is that? We live in a world where the word submissive is not only unpopular, it is almost like a curse word even to some in the church. In the Greek, the word submissive actually means to put in orderly fashion. It does not mean inferior. To submit does not mean you are saying you are inferior to anyone. It means that in the Bible that you have respect for the order in which God has set things. That's what it means. God wants order in this world. He wants order in the neighborhood, and He wants order in the home, and He wants order in the church. And of all people who should submit to that should be walking advertisements for God. So when we submit, we are volunteering to place our lives in order to serve others so that God may be glorified. All too often we want to serve others so we get the credit, so we get the advertisement. But this is how we're to live before the pagans. We submit to God's way to glorify God. And that, when we live this kind of life before the pagans, is how we shut them up, Peter says. And for the next 2 chapters of 1 Peter, which evidently I'm not going to get into, he will be telling us how our lives, when they're lived in submissive order, will not only help us to walk the submissive walk before the pagans and unbelievers in the world, he's going to tell us how it glorifies God at the same time. And with these 3 principles that Peter has just shared with us about living our lives in a pagan world as aliens and strangers, we walk and we talk and we live lives as advertisements for Christianity and for God and Christ. He also tells us we understand that to the pagans, our walk is louder than our talk. And thirdly, he says we are to walk a submissive life. So as submissive sojourners, as Peter is writing to those he has called sojourners, strangers and aliens in a world that do not understand and in most times don't want to understand Christianity, Peter is telling us here are 3 things that's got to happen. First, we will respect human governments. We will respect human governments. He says in verses 13 through 17, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor." I want to make an observation concerning human governments, especially as Peter addresses it in this text. Human governments that are set up by God and originally meant by God are to be responsible for both the physical and moral well-being of its people. I don't think we hear enough about that from Washington. Now notice what Peter is saying. Government is to punish the wrongdoers, that is, to protect the innocent, and notice, to command or to commend those who do right. That is the moral side of government. Now we hear a lot about the physical, do we not? How about we hear a lot from Washington about what? Jobs and economy. But what about the moral, economic, and climate of the citizens? What that means is there are some absolute rights and wrongs in this world that government is supposed to recognize and acknowledge. But what I have noticed is that we don't get many people in government who are willing to admit that there are some absolute wrongs and rights. But I want you to know something. Regardless of what kind of government the church has been called to live under, she still has thrived and survived. The church is just still here, and you can go back and see all the different kinds of governments the church has been called to live under. Some and many and most of those governments are gone, but where's the church? She's still here. She has survived and she has thrived because she has fought. Now listen carefully. She has fought with the weapon of submission. That's how she has survived. The only time the church has ever refused to submit to human institution or laws is when those laws commanded the church to be quiet about Jesus. When Peter wrote this letter, one of the biggest enemies of the cross and the enemies of Christianity was a man who was running that country, who was the king of that country. His name was Nero, and he was no friend to any Christian. And yet, what did Peter say? You honor that person. You submit. And Peter, who was talking to those Christians who were suffering because of that man, he didn't say, you start leading a revolution. He said, you submit to his authority. Peter said, honor the king. All of us have lived under some pretty good and sometimes not so good presidents, senators, congressmen. But brethren, if we are going to live lives to glorify God, we must honor them. And I will tell you, if any of those today who are attacking and dishonoring our present leaders and call themselves Christians, Peter is saying they have ruined their witness to this world concerning the cross of Jesus. Because we are supposed to be following a man who submitted. The one whose name we wear submitted. And it cost him his life. Peter will remind us of that in chapter 2, verse 21. This does not mean we cannot speak out against injustices. It does not mean we cannot call evil evil. It does not mean that we cannot call bad good or good bad. It means we do like the prophets of old and like our follower, like the one we follow. We tell the truth, but we still submit. What it does mean also for Christians that we never allow the rule of government to supersede the will of God in our lives. I want to say that again. It does not mean that we allow the rule of government to supersede the will of God in our lives. Remember the very man, Peter, who just told us to honor the government leaders in Acts chapter 4 through 5, was arrested and told he was to no longer preach Jesus. When he was released, what did he do? He continued to preach Jesus. But as Christians, we also need to be so involved in good deeds that when the critics criticize us, they will recognize our good works, and that's going to confuse them. That's why submission works. Secondly, we will respect our employers. Notice what Peter said in 18 and 20. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, it is commendable before God. Now the word slave there in this text means anyone who has placed themselves under the employment of another. Therefore it means doctors, school teachers, the landscaper, or the clerk at Walmart. Matter of fact, after I retire, you may see me at Walmart as a greeter, one of my dream jobs. Let me tell you, this passage is simply saying, if you work for someone else, this text applies to you. So as an employee, it doesn't matter how good or harsh your boss may be. Peter is saying, as a Christian, you must wield the mighty sword and weapon of submission. Now, what makes this so important in the day of Peter is that because Christians were already highly suspected people. If you worked for a boss who was highly suspicious of you because you are a Christian, because of your religion, the best way to convince him that Jesus' followers were of no threat would be based on how you acted at work. And today, if you claim to follow Jesus, but you're constantly rebelling against the authority that's over you, you are defaming the name of Christ, Peter is telling us. So I ask, and I think this is the question Peter wanted each one to ask of themselves as this passage was read to them. How do you handle unfairness at work? It is one thing if you are a careless and you are a bad employee with a bad attitude and you suffer because of that. Peter's saying if that's the way you're acting, that's the way you deserve to be treated. But how do you handle it when you're the best worker but the least appreciated? How do you handle it when you deserve the promotion but it went to someone else who didn't deserve it? How do you handle that? How do you handle it when do you handle it with slander against your boss when things like that happen? Do you decide then I'll just become a lousy worker and become slothful? Do you play the victim role? Well, let me tell you, if you do, you are allowing someone else to control your life and your attitude. And Peter is saying, don't do that. You submit. Peter is saying, let Jesus control your life. You maintain a spirit of submission, a spirit of grace, and yes, a spirit of forgiveness. You want an example? Just look at Jesus on the cross. Submission to the authorities. Why? Because ultimately he was submitting to God. So as sojourners, we learn to submit to all authority. But thirdly, as strangers and aliens in this world, he said we will respect our roles in the home. Husbands, fathers, let me ask you a question. Are you the leader in your home? You know your first obligation to being the leader in your home is to be an example of submission to God. That means you're following Jesus. Paul says in Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. That means, husbands, you are to love your wives as Christ loved the church, which means you get to sacrifice first. And you do it for her. Wives, do you respect your husbands? Ephesians 5:33 says, and the wife must respect her husband. I have heard some wives telling me, and sometimes it's usually in counseling, I will not respect him until he earns it. Let me say something here. Respect is what men crave. And they long for respect from their wives just as much as wives crave love from their husbands. Let me put it this way. What love is to a woman is what respect is to a husband. It's like the husband and wife are in the deep bottom of the ocean in deep sea diving suits. And they're connected to the surface with an air hose. And that is the only thing keeping them alive, is that air coming through that hose. Husbands, if you're not the spiritual leader in the home and loving your wife as Christ loved the church, what you're essentially doing is you are stomping and shutting down her air supply. And you're slowly killing her. And let me ask you, can you live with that air? Wives, he says, in the same way, when you disrespect your husband and you disrespect his God-given role as the head of the home, husbands, you're stepping, or wives, you're stepping on his air supply, and you're slowly killing his love. And what happens when people start starving for air? They don't act normal, do they? If you don't believe it, go home today and put a sack over your head, a plastic. No, don't do that. Somebody will do it and I'll get blamed for it. But just try to hold your breath as long as you can. After a few seconds, you're going to start acting any way but normal. Brethren, Peter is saying the home of all places is where the world should be able to look and see where God's order is deeply respected, submitted to, and obeyed. Peter is saying our example of submission to the governing authorities, to our bosses at work and in the home, are to be examples that this pagan world will look at, and they're going to have to conclude that's what Jesus and Christianity looks like. In other words, when people look at us, we're going to be advertising something. Peter is saying, you are a walking advertisement for Christ. And it all begins with the first step. You've got to die to your old nature and submit to the authority of Christ. If you don't submit there, the rest of it makes no difference. Have you been baptized into Christ? Have you submitted to His authority? A big part of what baptism is submission. You're submitting yourself to someone else to save you and to walk in a life of submission to them. And that's the best advertisement in the world for Christ. If you've not been baptized into Christ, or maybe you have not been following Christ, maybe you need the prayers of this church to help you in your walk with God. If we can help you in any of those things or anything else that you may need prayer for, or if you need to be baptized, we would ask you to come to the front and we stand and sing for your encouragement. Would you come?